Welcome to the presentation for Chapter 3, and this chapter is called Basis of a Healthy Diet. Now in this presentation we're just going to hit some of the high points and I'll leave it up to you to read the rest of it. So in this presentation we will be briefly discussing the U.S. dietary guidelines, in particular the MyPlate dietary guidance system. And we're going to be looking at food labeling, including the nutrition facts panel that you'll see on food products, the supplement labels and how they differ from foods and other drugs that are on the market. And we'll take a look at organic foods and organic food labeling. So let's just talk about what influences our nutrient needs. Our individual lifestyles and our ages. For instance, babies will need different amounts of nutrients versus adults. Your sex, your general health status, and use of specific medications. And for instance, the antibiotics tetracycline and Cipro combine with calcium in some dairy foods and keep the body from absorbing it. So you have to be careful when taking antibiotics, especially long term. Now, for many years, scientists have studied the impact nutrients have on our bodies, and through the research they've done, they've been able to estimate nutrient requirements for a healthy human body. The nutrient requirements are the smallest amount of a nutrient that maintains a defined level of nutritional health or lowers your risk for getting a disease. Your body can store many nutrients in your liver, fat, and bones, and it'll make withdrawals from these stores when the needs increase for those nutrients. Now, I'm not going to be speaking about dietary reference intakes in this presentation because I provided a video on the Blackboard site, but I need you to make sure that you go over estimated average requirements, the recommended dietary allowances, adequate intakes, tolerable upper intake levels, and acceptable macronutrient distribution range. The DRIs, that's just a generic term for a set of nutrient reference values. Nutrition experts use these to make dietary recommendations. And again, make sure you just watch the video. It has some great visuals on it to understand these concepts. Now, the DRIs don't translate to actual amounts or servings of food. And honestly, they don't translate to any type of information the average person can use on a daily basis. So if we can't practically use the DRIs, what do we use to help us choose a healthy diet? Well, nutrition experts have classified food groups and used the DRIs to develop dietary guidance systems, and the current one being MyPlate. And we'll discuss this in a few slides from now. But these systems provide a more meaningful way for consumers to evaluate their diets and improve them if necessary. And I'm sure you've seen the MyPlate visual before, showing the 5 classified food groups, which are fruits, vegetables, grains, proteins, and dairy. I am not going to go over all of the food groups. Again, read about those in your book. I am going to touch on grains, however, on the next slide. Okay, so I chose to talk about grains because of a couple of topics on here, enrichment and fortification. Now, included in the grains group are foods made from wheat, rice, and oats. And most of the pastas, breads, oatmeal, and breakfast cereals you consume will fall into this group. And the major macronutrients in grains are carbohydrates and proteins. Now, grains can be divided into 2 subgroups, which are whole grains and refined grains. I'm sure you've heard these terms before, but what do these mean? Whole grains contain the entire grain kernel with the bran, germ, and endosperm intact. This includes things like whole wheat flour, cracked wheat, oatmeal, whole cornmeal, and brown rice. Now, the refined grains group contain things like white flour, degermed cornmeal, white bread, and white rice. These refined grains can still be a good source of vitamins and minerals if they are enriched or fortified. And like I said, these are probably terms you've seen printed on food labels, but you might not know what they mean. So enrichment is the addition of vitamins and or minerals to grain products that were lost during the refinement process. Refinement removes much of the outer part of the grain in order to give the grain a finer texture and to extend the shelf life of the grain in the store. because the natural oils in the germ and bran of whole grains can cause the grain to go rancid quicker. So the shelf life's a lot shorter. So you'll often see enriched on boxes of pasta or bags of flour in the supermarket. Now, fortification is the addition of nutrients to a food that were never there to begin with, so this is a bit different. For instance, oranges are not a good source of calcium, but most orange juice is fortified with calcium. And this is because most Americans fall short in their intake of calcium. And milk is also fortified with vitamins A and D. So those were never there to begin with in the food product, or were there in such small amounts that it doesn't really help you in the long run. So I put this visual up here. It shows what whole grains look like versus refined grains. And feel free to go back to the slide and take a look at it. It just shows you what a whole grain looks like versus what the refined grain looks like when it's been stripped of all the main nutrients. Like I said, I want you to read about the food groups, the vegetable, fruit, dairy, and protein groups, and understand which types of foods fall into these groups. So, food guides have been around for over 70 years. The first one was introduced in 1943, and you can see the one on the right-hand side of this slide. It was called the Seven Food Groups. And because this was during World War II and Americans were still receiving food rations, the USDA made the statement that you could eat any other foods that you wanted. And since food wasn't as available during wartime, that was okay. It didn't really matter what you ate as long as you had food. Now, this was modified over the years, but was not significantly changed until 1992, when the food guide pyramid was introduced, and you probably remember seeing this at some point. This became My Pyramid in 2005, which was the first interactive system where you could go online to see more about dietary guidelines. We're going to go to the next slide to see about the current food guide system. Now, earlier in the presentation, I talked about how DRIs are used to develop food guides for consumers to use to make healthy food choices. And in 2011, the current food guide system, which is called My Plate, was introduced and it replaced the pyramid. And you can see right here, take a look at this graphic. It is easily recognizable as a plate. And you can see that fruits and vegetables make up half of your plate, and grains make up a little more than half of the other side, while proteins make up the rest. And a cup of dairy sits beside the plate to remind you to take in dairy, which is specifically for calcium. So you don't have to take in milk. You can use a dairy alternative as long as it has been fortified with some type of calcium in it. So My Plate is also an interactive tool, a dietary menu planning tool, and you can go to the website choosemyplate.gov. If you visit the website, you'll see that there's a ton of information on it, link after link after link, from meal ideas to exercise guidelines for both adults and children. And those recommendations are based on the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans, and you can read about those on the website. Now, the different shape, like I said, the plate was meant to be able to grab consumers' attention, and the picture's meant to serve as a reminder for healthy eating. Obviously, you're not going to get any specific guidelines by looking at this plate itself. Other than the actual visual, a major difference between the My Pyramid and My Plate is that My Plate does not include oils. You may have noticed that. And even though we need healthy fats in our diet, oils and fats were omitted on the plate since they're usually ingredients in food and not a separate food group itself. Now, when you go to the Choose My Plate website, like I said, you will see a lot of information. It's pretty overwhelming at first when you go onto there. But they used to have a program on the website called Super Tracker, and it was there until June 30th of this year, 2018. And it was a program used to assess your diet and activity, and you could input your diet and activity levels, and it would give you recommendations on it. But because of apps like MyFitnessPal or there's another one called Lose It, And there are many other private sector apps and programs that do the same thing. USDA decided to discontinue the program and spend their money elsewhere. They wanted to pour their resources into other nutritional information, so they just discontinued that. Now, your textbook still talks about it, but it has since been discontinued. Now, on the website, you can find information about each food group, guidelines for incorporating physical activity, and dietary recommendations for specific population groups. Now, do Americans really utilize the tools provided by USDA on the Choose My Plate website? We would like to think so, but do they really do it? And I did something a little funny. I actually did my own unscientific poll, and in fact, it was quite unscientific, but I just wanted to see if any of my friends would respond. So I took it upon myself to go onto social media and ask the question if you had actually been to the website, used it, and recognized my plate. So 30 people responded to my poll. These are people that I know, most of whom are very well educated and have access to the internet basically at all times, whether on their phone, computer, whatever. Only 4 people out of the 30 said that they had been to the website, and one of those was me because I had to start the poll. So, really, only 3 had. Um, Now, I'd be interested to know if you, as students, have ever spent time on the website before. Feel free to post to my virtual office or the general discussion board if you want to give your input on this. So, really, I think it's being very underutilized, and people are not using these resources, and it's actually a lot of money the USDA has spent on this without as many results, positive results as they would have liked. So we're going to skip on a little bit to food labels. Now, you could spend an entire class on this, and in fact, I taught an entire course called Food Laws and Regulations that spent a lot of the semester focusing on what could be on food labels. You probably use these when you're shopping, just to figure out what kind of ingredients are in a food product or what the nutritional value is of that food. Now, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is the agency who regulates what type of information goes onto food labels. When you're shopping, you'll see that most foods are labeled with the product's name, the manufacturer's name and address, how much food is in the package, and a list of ingredients in descending order by weight. So, for example, if wheat flour is the largest ingredient by weight, that'll be the first ingredient that you see on the ingredients list. And you can see I have a picture of that right here. Now, you won't see nutrition labels on fresh fruits and vegetables because raw agricultural commodities are currently exempt from having to be labeled. However, according to the U.S. country of origin labeling law, the retailers must label the fruit or vegetable with where it came from. If the fruit or vegetable is too small to label, like a green bean, you may see a sign listing the country of origin. But if you pick up an apple or a bunch of bananas, you'll usually see a sticker on it, and it will tell you where the product originated from. So that's helpful if you're interested in learning about that. Okay, so what are you going to see on food packages themselves? Probably the most important part of the food label for our class's purposes is the nutrition facts panel. Now, the percent daily values that you see on a food label are a guide to the nutrients in one serving of that food. And it's based on a standard adult diet that supplies 2,000 kilocalories per day. So it's very general. Ideally, each day you want to get 100% of the DVs for carbs, protein, fats, fiber, vitamins, and minerals. And as you hopefully read in your textbook, a food that supplies 5% or less of the daily value of a nutrient is considered a low source of the nutrient, and one that supplies 20% or more is considered a high source or good source of the nutrient. So take a look at the graphic on this slide. For this serving of food, which the serving size is not shown here, it provides 18% of your daily allowance of fat. And if you look at the bottom, you can see that if you eat one serving, you have 82% of your fat allowance remaining. But if you eat 2 or 3 servings, which is surprisingly easy to do depending on the food, you may have consumed much more of the allowance in just one meal. So be very aware of serving sizes in packaged food products because A serving of cereal may only cover the bottom of the bowl. And if you're like me, you pour at least half or more of the bowl without even thinking about it. And I have actually measured it out before, and some of the cereals that I eat. And honestly, a serving is is very small. You may put 2 to 3 servings in a bowl and not even realize it. So you may want to take a look at that from now on, and just it's just kind of interesting to see how much we actually eat in a sitting, and if that matches what the recommended serving size is. So, besides your daily value percentages, what will you find on the nutrition facts panel? You'll find your serving size, information about fat, cholesterol, and sodium, carbohydrate, including fiber, your total sugars and added sugars, protein, along with how much vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium are in a serving of food. Now, why those particular vitamins and minerals and not all the others? Well, Americans don't always get the recommended amounts of vitamin D, potassium, calcium, and iron, so these specific ones are featured on food labels. Now, be sure to read about health claims that can be on labels because I'm not going to discuss those right now, although it is very interesting and often confusing what can be on food labels, what can be labeled as being healthy or low fat or helping with, reduction of heart disease. It's quite an interesting topic. Now, I did want to briefly discuss the labels you see on dietary supplements because these are different from what you will see on foods or prescription or drugs that are actually approved by the FDA. And by supplements, I mean vitamins, minerals, herbs, botanicals, amino acids, anything that's taken by a pill, capsule, tablet, or in liquid form that's considered a supplement. And they can often be beneficial to your health, but you do have to be aware of possible risks associated with them. Now, what's important to remember is the FDA does not review dietary supplements for safety and or effectiveness like they do with drugs prior to their release to the market. Now, this is up to the manufacturer to ensure safety. And in fact, the FDA only steps in when a problem arises, usually once the product is on the market. Then they can take supplements off the market and take action against the manufacturer. Supplement labels must include the name and location information for the manufacturer or distributor, the dosage, and a supplemental facts panel. It also must include the statement, and I'm sure you've seen this. This statement has not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration, and it's not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. So be real cautious when you are buying supplements. The ones usually in the supermarket or supplement type stores are generally safe. Ordering online is a bit iffy if you don't really know where they are coming from. Um, you certainly want to do your research before taking supplements because they aren't regulated in the same way. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention before closing this presentation is a little about organic foods. And sales of organic foods hit a record $43 billion in 2015, and interest in the products are increasing each year. Organic foods are those grown, produced, or raised without the use of antibiotics, hormones, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides. They aren't genetically modified, and they don't, uh, irradiation is not used on the products. Usually, irradiation is used to extend the shelf life, to kill any molds or bacteria that are on products. Table 3.14 in the textbook gives a good comparison between organic and conventional farming systems. So take a look at that to get a better understanding of the farming methods. And keep in mind that organic foods are generally not any more nutritious than conventionally grown foods, as this is often a point of confusion with people I educate about nutrition. They think that just because something is organic, it is not only more nutritious, but maybe it tastes better, or there are all sorts of myths out there. But for organic foods, there definitely will be a decrease in the amount of residue of pesticides and things like that. And as for labeling of organic foods, they can be labeled as organic if they meet strict USDA standards. And you can see right here the USDA organic symbol on this can of vegetable soup. And I'm sure you've all seen that symbol before. Now, keep in mind there are different labeling categories, and that some foods can have small amounts of non organic ingredients in them and still be labeled as organic. So, as you can see on this slide, and I buy this type of thing for my family, so it interests me. This particular package of Annie's brand shells and cheese is made with organic pasta, but not all the other ingredients in the package are 100% organic. You can look all over the package and not see the official USDA organic seal on it because it does not meet the criteria to be called, completely organic. Now, the company does make other mac and cheese products that are completely organic and do bear the seal. So, if it's 100% organic, you can use the USDA seal on it. Um, it can say organic and still have the USDA seal on it if it contains at least 95% organic ingredients. The remaining 5% of ingredients are on the USDA's list of allowed ingredients. Or it can say made with organic ingredients, like this package of pasta, which contains 70 to 95% organic ingredients. So sometimes it can get confusing if you aren't aware of the terminology. Now, I really like this chapter, partially because I really enjoy learning about food labeling and the MyPlate system. But if you do have questions about anything I talked about or did not talk about, because there are several things I did not talk about, serving size, for instance, was in this chapter. Of course, the other food groups were in this chapter. There's so much more um, to discuss, but this presentation could go on and on if that's the case. The more you dive into these topics, the more confusing it can seem, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I really enjoy talking about it. So contact me if you have any questions about this material at all, or post in my virtual office or the general discussion forum.